August 20, 1977, horseback riders in California's Sierra Nevada mountains make a terrible discovery.
One of the riders got a little ahead of the other one and pulled off the trail, and that's when Bren Rainey's body was discovered. It was a very horrific scene.
2 years later, another young woman's body discovered nearby.
She was choked, she was sexually assaulted, and then her body was dumped on the side of the road. It would strongly suggest that she fought for her life.
Both cases go cold and stay that way until 2017, when the former girlfriend of a suspect comes forward with new and disturbing evidence.
She described a few incidents between the two of them. One of them, she said they were in a hot tub together and he held her head underwater to the point where she was gagging on the water.
I thought, was he gonna drown me there and put me in his truck?
This is the story of the South Tahoe Strangler and how a remarkable new technology, investigative genetic genealogy, is used against him as a weapon.
Without forensic genealogy in this case, I don't know that we would have solved it. It was a huge part of this investigation.
Criminals who hide in the shadows for years now discover they may not be able to hide from forensic science and their own family tree. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. (1977), El Dorado County on America's West Coast. It's a former gold rush area, but now it's better known for unspoiled scenery and lively casinos.
El Dorado County is in Northern California. It's approximately 200,000 residents. It stretches from the border of Sacramento County all the way up to the border of Nevada and South Lake Tahoe.
Tahoe in the 70s was the place to be seen outside of Vegas by the major stars of the day. They had Elvis, Sonny and Cher, Florence Henderson. There were a lot of local stars back then that were at the casinos in the Nevada side. And back in the 70s, the Hard Rock was the Sahara.
It was a mecca for young people in their early 20s to work and party and spend their time.
Bren Rainey and her brother moved to California searching for new opportunities.
Bren Rainey was originally from Ohio. She came out to the Lake Tahoe area in 1977. She came out here with other family members, fell in love with the South Lake Tahoe area and decided to stay.
April of 1977, she's hired by the Sahara Casino as a keno runner from people, and they take them in and take your money and go place the bet for you and bring it back. And they would run around the casino back in those days when they had keno and it wasn't all electronic, run the numbers and then take them back to the person.
July 25, 1977, Bren Rainey doesn't show up to work.
She was due to work at 2 a.m. on the 25th. She never showed up for that work shift. On the August 15th, her landlord reported her missing. The landlord had said that he had seen her around the time that she had last been seen, which would have been around July 24th, and that he had not seen her since. They did initial investigation. They contacted family members. They talked to her employers and did what they could. They also put out an APB. They called back then, and it was a national notification of a missing person that was out. So they did pretty much all they could do with that at the time.
1 month after Bren Rainey's reported missing, horseback riders make a gruesome discovery near the casino town of State Line.
On August 20th, 1977, a body was found at the Horse Stable Park. She was found just off a trail in a shallow grave that had been disturbed.
It was a very horrific scene. She was pulled out of the grave that she was buried in. The grave site was about 6 feet by 18 inches by about 2 feet deep, and she had been dug up out of the grave by animals and partially exposed. Her clothing was found about 30 feet from her that included in her panties, the bra, the shirt, the blue jeans, her purse.
Among her belongings was a work identification that included her name, and that led detectives at that time to identify her as Bryn Rainey.
Detectives send Bryn Rainey's body to the coroner for autopsy.
The autopsy showed that the cause of death was strangulation. She had bruising on her as well as a broken hyoid bone.
Anytime you have a shallow grave that's been predated by animals, there's other layers that you have to sift through and trying to figure out what's a wound and what's an animal mark. And they also would have been able to tell whether or not it was human blood, and they would have been able to identify seminal fluid.
The fact that her clothing had been removed from her body and was located near the shallow grave would suggest that she was brought out to that location alive. Whatever assault occurred likely occurred at that location, and then she was killed at that location. And the killer, of course, took some rudimentary steps in order to conceal the body by putting it in a shallow grave. And then you have to consider the digging of that grave, and you wonder if it occurred prior to the murder. In other words, did the killer prepare that spot in advance? Or is it something that was done on the spur of the moment?
Now, police must tell Bryn Rainey's family the horrible news.
We weren't able to make death notification in person. And so local law enforcement reached out to law enforcement in the state of Ohio and asked for their assistance. And as part of that process, it came to light that Bryn's mother had a heart condition, and there was some concern that the shock of learning that her daughter had been murdered could have a physical effect on her. And so local law enforcement was able to get her physician at the time to come with them when they went to her home and broke the terrible news that her daughter had been murdered.
Bryn did not have any enemies. There was no one that would have had a reason to kill her. And the family just wanted to know what happened. They believed that someone could have possibly been responsible that they knew.
One of the interesting facts in this case is that an unidentified male called Bryn Rainey's employer and informed them that she would not be showing up for her shift at the casino where she worked. We certainly don't know for sure who that was that made the call, but under the circumstances and the fact that Bryn at that time was likely already dead, it would strongly suggest that the killer made that call in order to buy more time before people knew she was missing.
While detectives try to trace that mystery caller, they also piece together Bryn Rainey's last known movements.
She'd been picked up earlier that evening by a friend and dropped off at a bar that used to be there called the Bitter Creek. It was just kind of a beer bar. And she had gone to this bar, and witnesses were interviewed that said that she was in the bar. And she was there till that evening. And she had told her friend that she was going to catch a bus. But we're talking about her shift starting at 2 a.m. on the 25th. And to me, it sounds like she either could have been hitchhiking or picked up a ride from somebody else to try to get down the boulevard, which would have been a good 5 or 6 miles away. One of the main guys that they focused in on was a boyfriend that had come from Ohio, and he was infatuated with her. But then they were able to eliminate him pretty early because they were able to prove that he had left town 2 days before Bryn Rainey was last seen.
2 years go by and detectives run out of leads.
And the case became cold as a result. But on July 1st, 1979, a young woman's body was found on the side of the road by a passing motorist and reported to law enforcement.
2 years after Bryn Rainey's murder, the discovery of a second young woman's body in the same area injects new life into the investigation. Could the same killer be responsible for both murders? That's next on Bloodline Detectives. August 1977, horseback riders in California's Sierra Nevada mountains discover the remains of a woman in a shallow grave close to Lake Tahoe. She's later identified as a casino worker, 27-year-old Bryn Rainey. Police have very few clues, and the case goes cold. Then, 2 years later, A second female victim is discovered nearby.
A young woman's body was found on the side of the road in South Lake Tahoe. A passing motorist saw her body laying on the side of the road and stopped, and then contacted law enforcement and reported that they had found what they believed to be a deceased young woman.
She was wearing socks, no shoes, jeans, and rock and roll Rod Stewart t-shirt from a concert in 1979. She had pretty significant injuries to her upper body, facial area, neck area. Ligature marks were apparent on her wrists. On her face, there was an elongated mark on her cheek that looked like it either could have been some type of gag or a rope that had caused the damage. Later on, they found that her bra was pulled up over her breasts and under her shirt, and that she had fingernail scratch marks under her right breast.
Detectives struggled to identify the victim. Then they received news of a missing person.
The South Lake Tahoe Police Department had learned that there was a party and that there were juveniles at the party. And when they investigated that party, which was near where the body had been recovered, they were able to identify a young man who had picked this young woman up and brought her to the party and then essentially lost track of her.
They're actually the ones that helped identify her the next day. There were some police officers that went down to a local beach called Reagan Beach and talked to her friends, to these boys, and they're the ones that said, I think that might have been this friend of ours named Carol Anderson.
They were able to go and contact the victim's parents. The parents showed a photograph of their daughter, Carol Anderson, and law enforcement was immediately able to recognize that they had found this couple's daughter.
An autopsy reveals the COD, cause of death.
Carol's body showed signs of severe trauma to her face, to her neck. She showed signs of ligature marks on her wrists as if she'd been tied. Carol also had a damaged hyoid bone. Carol's cause of death was strangulation as well.
They looked at clothing items just to see whether or not there was anything odd about the clothing items that were there. They collected quite a few clothing items, all of the undergarments, the outer garments. They're looking for any kind of bite marks, things like that, that they might be able to get any kind of body fluid from a suspect or a perpetrator. And they're taking hair samples. So they're taking hair from the pubic area, they're taking hair from the head, and that way we can do any comparisons if there's any of those pieces of evidence that are found later on somebody, on their clothing or anything else if they have a suspect.
Forensic investigators collect a DNA sample that does not belong to the victim. In the meantime, police piece together Carol Anderson's final hours.
That morning, it was reported that she left her house around 10 a.m. on Saturday. Now, it's summer, she's out of school, it's South Lake Tahoe, the weather's beautiful, it's a beautiful place, and she's hanging out with her friends. So she's down at Reagan Beach, where all the kids hung out, going back and forth probably to liquor stores or doing whatever they do there as kids. She hears about a party, which is not very far from Reagan Beach. This party that Carol had been at was given by guys that were in their early 20s that were renting the house. And there were quite a few people there, 60 to 70 people, it's estimated, were at the party. And the reports indicate that she was there in the evening, and she was there and then left around 11:30. There's different stories that she was offered rides and refused them, and there's other people that say she left with somebody, and then there's all kinds of different theories that were looked at.
One of the early thoughts was that because Carol Anderson had been at this party, that her killer may have been at the party, and that may be where her killer came into contact with her and perhaps lured her away from the party, or was willing to give her a ride away from the party or a ride home, and that's how he was able to gain control over her. And so it was really important to us to identify as many people as possible who were at that party to see if any of them either might be responsible for Carol Anderson's death or might know something that would help us move the investigation forward.
Police follow up on every single lead, but in the end, Carol Anderson's case goes cold. Then, in the early 2000s, a cold case unit reopens the investigation.
One of the things that moves any of these cases forward dramatically is when we're able to develop some forensic evidence that can link the killer to the crime. And in the Carol Anderson case, we were able to test samples that had been collected during her autopsy and preserved for decades. And the result of that testing was developing a male DNA profile. And so you need to find that person and you need to match them to the evidence that they left behind. And one of the first things we do when we have a robust profile is we add it to the CODIS database, and we look to see if there are any matches to known offenders. And in this particular case, there were no matches. And so we needed to continue to search for people who may have crossed paths with Carol Anderson, who may have been in the area, who may have been motivated to commit this kind of a crime, and get from them either surreptitiously or voluntarily a DNA sample to test back to the crime scene DNA.
Detectives have an individual DNA profile for the prime suspect. Now they need to match that profile to a name.
They were focusing on the party where she'd last been seen and the people that were at the party. So there were a lot of interviews and identifying the people that were there and getting their names. It became a priority to go out and try and get their DNA. The investigator that actually had it, Brett Peterson, he had 2 binders for people that were at the party. One binder was people that were in CODIS or that we had DNA from, and the other binder was people that needed to get it. And that binder, the team would periodically, we'd be somewhere, we'd find somebody, we'd go interview them, and we get that DNA and check it, and it would come back negative, but we kept going, kept pushing it.
It's a huge task. 60 cold cases and a mountain of evidence.
We brought together all 60 unsolved cases, and we did a thorough review of each and every one of them, and we tried to categorize them. So we had cases from the 70s and the 80s where physical evidence items were collected at the crime scene, packaged and preserved by law enforcement, but had never been subject to modern technology and had never been checked for DNA evidence, for example. And so we started working through those cases as our first step. We identified the Bryn Rainey case as one that had never been subject to modern forensic technologies, and we thought that might provide us with a lead.
In 2017, Deanna Hayden, who's a senior criminalist at the Department of Justice, re-examined the shirt. I remember it being at the task force and the discussion taking place. She said, I think I'm going to take another look at that shirt and see what I can find. And she did that. She took another cutting off a blood stain, was able to develop a pretty significant DNA profile.
The DNA extracted from Bryn Rainey's shirt undergoes testing alongside the male DNA collected from the Carol Anderson crime scene.
On November 17th of 2017, we received a message from DOJ that we had a match between the Bryn Rainey case and the Carol Anderson case through DNA. It meant that the same suspect was involved in both Bryn and Carol's murder. When we got that information from DOJ, we brought the team together and started again reviewing the case, looking at the similarities, and we started to make assignments for follow-up on what we were going to do next.
The really interesting thing is these 2 cases happened in such close proximity and time to each other. And we were working them in parallel, really. And then all of a sudden, we have no longer in parallel, we have one investigation for these 2 cases. And I'm sure that was something that investigators were happy to hear.
This was new information. This changed the way that we had been looking at both of these cases, and we immediately started to look for the imaginary Venn diagram of where and what connection these 2 victims might have with one another. And that was a big leap forward as far as searching for the killer.
2 victims, 1 killer. Can a new generation of Bloodline detectives crack this case? That's next. 2017, South Lake Tahoe, California. 2 young women murdered just 2 years apart, yet both their cases remain unsolved nearly 40 years. the remains of Bryn Rainey found in 1977, the body of teen girl Carol Anderson, just 16, discovered nearby 1979. Then, 2017, a breakthrough. Detectives discover the suspect's DNA samples from both murders are not just a match, they're a perfect match. Now, all detectives need is a name.
One of the first things we did was go back and re-review everything that we knew and everything that we thought we knew about both the Carol Anderson case and the Bryn Rainey case. And what we were looking for was any connection that we had failed to see in the past, any new interpretation that we could make of the information that we had based on the new knowledge that they had been both killed by the same person. It also, of course, brought to the forefront the idea that we were dealing with a person who was a serial killer in the sense that had killed at least twice and had killed two young women, both in the South Lake Tahoe area, had disposed of the bodies in a somewhat careless manner. There were some real indicators there that made us feel very strongly that we were going to be able to identify a suspect.
That same year, investigators team up with DNA investigative specialist, Parabon Nanolabs.
I joined forces with Parabon to offer a genetic genealogy service to law enforcement. I was one of the early adopters and one of the pioneers of genetic genealogy. And since that time, my team and I have been responsible for over 275 positive identifications. We started with two types of DNA tests called Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And then in 2010 is when we started using autosomal DNA, which is the basis for investigative genetic genealogy and the work we do with law enforcement.
We reached out and we established a contract with Parabon. We shared with Parabon the DNA information that we had.
In 2017, the crime scene DNA sample was sent to Parabon, and Parabon created a SNP profile with their partner lab. They worked with the agency on this case to predict what the suspect may have looked like.
Phenotyping is where you take areas in the DNA and you estimate genetic expressed traits. So that would be where they would go through and look at these areas of the DNA and decide whether or not they felt somebody had brown hair, blue eyes, whether or not they had any kind of predisposition for baldness, whether they would have had a round face, a slender face, those types of things to try and build what they would imagine would be how the DNA would express itself visually to us.
The phenotype test indicates the suspect is Caucasian with dark brown hair and dark eyes.
In December 2017, Parabon delivered their report with the snapshot phenotype predictions to the agency. And so in early May, the case managers reached out to the El Dorado authorities to ask them if they might be interested in trying genetic genealogy on Carol's case, and they agreed. Autosomal DNA is the type of DNA that you inherit from all of your ancestral lines. You receive 50% from your mother and 50% from your father, about 25% from each of your grandparents, and about 12.5% from each of your great-grandparents. And that type of DNA is essential to being able to identify someone from their DNA alone. We need to have lots of information, and we need to be able to piece that family tree together. And so we have to have DNA from different sides of the family tree, from different ancestral lines. We had a handful of matches that would be related somewhere in the second to fourth cousin range. And that means we're building those trees back to great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and then great-great-great-grandparents, trying to identify those common ancestors. It only took 2 days to narrow the genetic genealogy data down to just 3 brothers.
3 brothers that could potentially have been the contributors of the DNA recovered from Carol Anderson and from Bryn Rainey. The one that was of greatest interest to us was Joseph Holt, because we were able to establish that he lived in and around the South Lake Tahoe area during the time frame that these crimes occurred.
Through our investigation, we found Joseph Holt had grown up in Cupertino, California. He graduated from Cupertino High School. He went to Berkeley. He moved to South Lake Tahoe. He became a realtor. His profession throughout his life was real estate. He had a son. He was married at one point. We learned about some of Joseph Holt's relationships with different women. Investigator Gaines talked to a former girlfriend who said that Joseph Holt wanted to tie her up when they were intimate. One woman messaged us and said that she had dated Joseph Holt, that she had met him in South Lake Tahoe.
That woman is Colleen Wilson. Like the murder victim, Bryn Rainey, Colleen is a casino worker living in the South Lake Tahoe area.
I received a phone call from a homicide detective, and my heart just dropped when he introduced himself. I think he said, "You used to date Joseph Holt." And I said, yes, a long time ago. And I told him that I was living in a duplex on Ski Run, and he was the real estate agent. And I remember he came over to meet me and told me he was going to be showing the place. He would call me ahead of time. And I came home and there were some flowers on my table, and I thought, okay, did he show it to clients? And there was a little note there, a little card saying, "Thank you for cooperating, you're great." And then it said, I like you mucho más. And I go, okay, this is really strange, So came over, I said, "Did you show the place yesterday? You were in here?" And he says, "Oh yeah, I did. Didn't my office call you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Let me take you to dinner. I'm so sorry, to interrupt your life right now, and I know it's busy." So I said, "Okay, so." And he said, "Let's go to the hot tubs." And I said, "Oh, okay." And he goes, "Yeah, you need to relax. Let's go rent a hot tub." They were private. We went in, we were having a great time. And then I made a comment. I go, "Oh, I guess my waterproof mascara isn't waterproof." And then he took the back of my neck and he dunked my head. He goes, "Well, I can take care of that." And he dunked my head in the hot tub to where, then I didn't think it was funny. I was gagging water, and I said, "That's not funny. What are you doing?" He goes, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was just joking." And I think I was crying. And he goes, "I'm sorry. Come here." And I said, "Get away from me." And he goes, "No, please, don't walk home. It's dark out. Don't walk home. It's not safe. I will take you home." And I said, "You're not taking me anywhere."
Colleen Wilson's testimony paints a disturbing picture of Joseph Holt. But where is Holt? We find out next on Bloodline Detectives. Now, Bloodline Detectives are investigating 2 cold case murders, and they make a remarkable breakthrough. The victims are 2 young women murdered 2 years apart, way back in the 70s, near South Lake Tahoe, Northern California. The breakthrough is thanks to the expertise of Parabon Nanolabs, whose scientists are experts in genetic genealogy. Using DNA left at the crime scenes, Parabon narrows the suspects down to a single family. Police then identify Joseph Holt as the likely killer. Detectives then interview a former girlfriend of Holt, who offers a shocking account of their time together. Colleen Wilson recalls Holt pushing her head underwater in a hot tub.
I thought, was he gonna drown me there and put me in his truck and dump me somewhere? I thought about that a lot. I called my friend who worked in surveillance at Harvey's, and he said, "Lock the doors, I'll be over." He had an extra truck, he parked it in front of my duplex, and he came over and installed some locks. So I remember bolting every time I went to sleep. Every little noise would wake me up. Is it him creeping around? The next day, came with flowers again, apologized. "I'm sorry, I didn't, It got out of hand. I was just, roughhousing around. And he said, we need to go on a road trip. We need to go on a road trip, go to the ocean, get off the hill, get down to sea level. Let me make it up to you. I'm going to take you to Santa Cruz. We'll go to San Francisco, wherever you want. I almost went because he told me he goes, how much do you make it work? I go, well, you never know what tips are going to go. He goes, I will pay you to take the weekend off. And I said, no. I think it was like the second month, just really odd things were happening. I could tell somebody was coming into my place while I was at work. And I remember talking to my sister about it. First, she thought it was funny, and I didn't. I said, no, he's starting to get really creepy. And, and I asked her about the zip ties in his truck. I go, they were all over the floorboard. And she says, well, he could use them for his real estate signs. And then I go, okay, all right. And then he called and left a pretty nasty message on my answering machine and said, well, I see you've moved on. How many guys do you date? I see you have overnight guests all the time. I thought, okay, I really need to put some distance between he and I. Then he just kind of disappeared. I remember seeing him, I think it was in 1995, in Rayleigh's up here. And I go, oh my God, that's Joseph Holt. And I went down the other eye. I think I was about 8 months pregnant. And I know he saw me because they looked and I thought, I'm out of here with my basket. I think I just left that stuff there and went in the car.
In hindsight, Colleen Wilson believes she had a very lucky escape from Joseph Holt. Holt's on escape comes in a different and unexpected way.
After we identified Joseph Holt as a suspect, we learned that he had passed away in 2014 from a heart attack. And first thing we do when we find out that someone is dead is we try to see if there were any tissue samples collected, whether an autopsy was performed, if there's any possibility that there's something out there we can use to compare that deceased person's DNA with the DNA from the crime scene itself. And in the case of Joseph Holt, there was nothing left. So we had to move on to looking at his descendants. In particular, we focus on male descendants who are going to carry the father's DNA in their own DNA matrix.
I met with the son, told him that I believe that his dad may have known Carol Anderson and that I would like to get his DNA to eliminate him. And the son was cooperative, very cooperative. He told me that he had several things that belonged to his dad, that he had cleaned out his dad's house and had moved the things, and that he had access to those things. So I asked him if he would bring me some things that may belong to his dad that we might be able to establish DNA from, and he said he would be willing to do that. And he said he didn't want me to go with him. He wanted to bring them to me. And he brought me a jacket, some eyeglasses, a wallet, a used Q-tip, some, I believe, scissors, 5 harmonicas, and a toothbrush. I took them and packaged them up as evidence, and I brought them back to our office. I conferred with Deanna Hayden, and she said that she believed the toothbrush would be the most viable to get DNA from. That was transported to the DNA laboratory in Richmond, and she did the testing on it and confirmed that Joseph Holt was our perpetrator.
The story of Joseph Holt, the South Tahoe Strangler, doesn't quite end there. Cold case detectives are certain he murdered Bryn Rainey and Carol Anderson, but they also suspect Holt could be responsible for many other deadly crimes. We find out more next on Bloodline Detectives. Lake Tahoe, California, 2022. Bloodline detectives identify the killer of 2 young women in the late 70s. The investigation is helped by Parabon Nanolabs, which specialize in investigative genetic genealogy. The killer is Joseph Holt. Holt, now dead, but investigators are convinced he's responsible for many other crimes.
People who commit random acts of violence, particularly the ones that do it repeatedly, like Joseph Holt had, sometimes will document what they've done.
During the search, we found some interesting items. We found some weapons, A couple of them were illegal, sawed-off shotguns, that type of thing. Stun gun, handcuffs. I did find a newspaper clipping from him that was from Los Gatos, and he had handwritten on it the date of January 30th, 1975, and it referenced a burglary of a vehicle that occurred and that one of the victims had been shot. So they did a composite with the victims of the suspect. And if you look at that composite and you look at a picture of Joseph Holt, I don't think it takes a seasoned investigator to see the similarities in that composite.
We'll never really know how Joseph Holt selected his victims. We'll never really know how he came into contact with Bryn Rainey. Similarly to Bryn Rainey, we're really never going to know how Joseph Holt came into contact with Carol Anderson. We know that he was living near where the party took place, and it's reasonable to suspect that he was passing by the party, saw Carol Anderson perhaps walking or hitchhiking away from the party, trying to get home that evening, and he offered her a ride. I was present when investigators met with Carol Anderson's family to tell them what we had learned and to share with them that we had identified Carol's killer, but unfortunately he was dead and he was beyond the reach of justice. Bryn Rainey's family was still primarily in Ohio, and her brother lived in a very rural part of Colorado. So some of these contacts, by necessity, had to be made telephonically. And one of the investigators on the case and I called her brother and broke the news to him. And it was very impactful for him to know, finally, what had happened to his sister and to have a better understanding of everything that we had done in order to try to solve the case and to provide some degree of closure. And he was remarkably grateful for what we had done, even though it wasn't going to result in a prosecution or a conviction.
I think Joseph Holt was a very sick individual, and he has proven he was capable of incredible levels of depravity and violence and evil. And I don't know what makes a person like that. I mean, oftentimes it's a bad childhood. Some people just aren't good people, and I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to that. Maybe something traumatic happened to him when he was young, but it doesn't sound like that's something we'll ever know.
Ultimately, the South Lake Tahoe Strangler's identity is revealed through advanced science called investigative genealogy. Detectives and scientists alike use it to solve cases that are 30, 40, even 50 years old.
I think it was big news when we were able to put on social media that the case had been solved, that both cases from the 70s had been solved. I think it was big news for the community to know that the task force, that the agencies in the county are still working on these cases that are that old. It was surely exciting for us as a task force. Having worked these cases for 7, 8, 9 years, to bring one to closure is always exciting for us. To give the families of the victims closure is really one of our biggest goals. I think most of the time there's something left behind by the suspect in these cases. I think as science progresses, we will be able to utilize the smaller piece of evidence more and more as we go.
We owe a huge debt of gratitude to those original crime scene investigators for collecting this evidence. There is no way they could have known way back in the 70s just how important this evidence would be. Law enforcement wasn't even working with DNA yet at that time. And then the agencies that were in charge of storing this DNA for decades just did an incredible job. And there's no way that this case could have been solved without those original crime scene investigators and the agency that so carefully protected this DNA evidence for decades.
I wish he were here today to face the families, face the courts, rot in jail. He's evil, gets pleasure off of causing women pain. I don't think he ever changed. I would not be surprised at all if there were more victims. I had no idea he was capable of what he did. I thought, I am so lucky right now, because I really started thinking about it, and I said he kept pressuring me to go on that road trip with him, and I thought, what if I didn't come back? What if he threw me on the side of the road? And my mother used to tell me it's the quiet ones you have to watch out for. And I thought, oh, my mother, you're right. I mean, she was right.
It's amazing when we realize that now so many brutal killers can never hide from their own DNA, their own family tree, or from the incredible science of investigative genetic genealogy. We can only imagine the look of shock on their faces when, years later, when they believe they've gotten away with horrible crimes, bloodline detectives knock on their door. I'm Nancy Grace. Thanks for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.